Alrighty, welcome to another episode of Jurassic Garage. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to try something a little bit different today, bit of a story time type thing. I've got a bit of a point to make as well, basically that you don't need to spend 15 grand on a DC2 Type R or a whatever to have a nice enjoyable car that you can get a lot of enjoyment from. The Aerodeck videos, they'll be up as soon as they're ready, but I'm sure you can appreciate they take a lot of time to edit. There's a lot of me scratching my head and saying to edit out, and my girlfriend Chloe does all my editing. We both have full-time jobs and we both need time to ourselves, to be fair, so it does take a bit of time to get the episodes out. There is quite a bit of content already filmed but just not edited yet, so I thought I'd try this. It shouldn't require too much editing, so hopefully it can go out pretty quickly. It gives the channel a bit of variety as well. I don't want people to sort of get fed up of it just being Aerodeck content, especially when I don't actually tend to do that much in each video. But yeah, what I wanted to do today was almost like a build thread documenting my Honda Prelude. It's ended up being one of my favourite cars I've ever owned. Yeah, I just want to explain how it all happened, why I like it so much, some of the experiences that it's given me. I've got quite a few ideas of these, sat in my car talking type videos. So when I get a little bit more used to speaking to the camera, it's still a bit awkward. I've tried to find a quiet spot, but there's still people walking past and it just feels weird. But yeah, I need to get more comfortable with that. Try and improve my delivery a bit. Sound a little bit less monotonous and a little bit more interested and interesting. So I thought I'd start with a story that I know inside out. I have actually prepared a script so that I don't miss anything, because there's quite a bit to get through. If only I was that organised everywhere else in my life, eh? The point that I want to make with this video is if you're not set on, it has to be this car or whatever, and you play your cards right, you can end up with a really cool car that you get a lot of enjoyment out of, and you don't have to spend hardly any money. The price of Japanese stuff at the minute, well, not even just Japanese stuff. I mean, I was looking at Cavalier GSIs the other day, and if you can find one, they're 6-7 grand for an alright one. I want to show you how a bit of an underdog car can really get under your skin and just become such a good car, and you can really enjoy it. Preludes are totally forgotten about in the UK, apart from a small sort of band of enthusiasts, but they can be an absolute joy to own. They're a really good looking car. They've got some decent engines available. They come with a manual box. Some are auto, but you can get a manual one. Really cool interior, which I'll show you some photos of later. The full width digital dash. It's so futuristic and retro at the same time. Dead cool. And it's one of the few Japanese cars that's still affordable for some reason. One sold on Facebook Marketplace a couple of weeks ago. It was a Pacific Blue manual VTEC UK spec facelift, mint condition. I think it had tiny bubbles on the rear arches, but apart from that, honestly, it was flawless. And the guy was asking, I think, 1,950 quid for it. I'll stick some images up now. They'll have the price on. But it was less than 2 grand anyway. Obviously, it sold like that. Without any further ado, here's the story of my 1995 4th gen Honda Prelude VTEC with full Accord Type R running gear. So that's engine, gearbox, LSD and brakes. When I was a lot younger, I didn't really pay that much attention to Preludes. I'd seen them, thought they were pretty cool, but I only really saw them as a cheap engine swap for a Civic, and that's how everyone else sees them still. I'm older and wiser now that I've experienced one, grown to love it. But yeah, that's how most people see them, and I think that's unfair, to be honest. It does turn out they are actually better than Civics, don't tell anyone. As you might have figured out by now, I've always been well into my Hondas. But what's Honda's number one problem? Rust. Quite soon into owning Hondas, I realised you do really need to take them off the road for the winter because the salt just absolutely destroys them. Unfortunately for me, I happen to live on top of Britain's biggest salt mine. So when all the trucks come in from all over the country to get loaded up with salt, they spill it all over the roads, so the roads just end up absolutely covered in salt, more so than anywhere else. So it's even worse for me. So yeah, I've started taking them off the road, and I started getting just cheap Civics to abuse, not worry about, treat them as runarounds, have a bit of fun with them, and then scrap them or sell them. In fact, I scrapped them both. I saw a Prelude up for sale for 700 quid on Facebook. It wasn't even a post, it was a comment in a post. Didn't think too much of it, but then I was getting a bit fed up of driving a car that I didn't care about. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, God, I need to find that car, see if it's any good. I just couldn't get it out of my head. Tracked down the owner, went back, looked at the comments, found the comment, messaged him, and he had a bit going on in his life at the time, so he needed it gone. I messaged him, and he wanted 400 quid for it. Obviously, it was on my drive 2 days later. I won't bore you with too many more details, but I ended up really enjoying that car. It hardly owed me anything, so I could enjoy it and not be precious about it. I could thrash it about and, just have fun with it. It was pretty rusty. The bodywork it looked alright in photos, as you'll see. Close, it was pretty rough. It smoked on VTEC, and yeah, it was pretty rusty. So it was a rough example, but I mean, it's 400 quid. And obviously, it had that famous Prelude full-width digital electroluminescent dash. It's so cool. You need to see it at night. So yeah, I was really starting to fall for it, to be honest. I went to a track day at Anglesey that a few of my mates were on, and just intending to watch, just something to do on a Saturday morning or whatever it was. And my mate Kelvin, in his EG6, had an issue with his car. I can't remember what it was. Either the clutch went, or he snapped a drive shaft, or something like that. So he said I could have the rest of his track day. I was like, well, I haven't done any prep on my car, but you know, I'm not going to say no to that, am I? And it ended up being absolutely hilarious. The car was so much fun. It was just lift off oversteer for days. It had like a winter tyre on the back left, something else on the back right, and 2 decent Yokohamas up front. So yeah, it was quite tail happy, but it was really forgiving and stable. You could get it so sideways, but it would always come back, and it was just a right laugh. Brilliant. That ended up coming off the road for a bit, because I did have my EG6 by this point, and it was fully rebushed, track ready, and I just wanted to enjoy it. Then I took the EG6 to the Nürburgring and had a little bit of an issue. There's definitely going to be a video on that. That was a nightmare. That ended up with me leaving my car in Belgium and getting a flight home. But yeah, definitely be a video on that. That's a good story. Well, it wasn't at the time. So got the Prelude back on the road because the Civic was kind of dead. A few weeks later, the cam belt went. Wasn't great. I had a yard at this point. So I jumped on Facebook, tried to find a donor car for an engine, and a 5th gen VTI popped up in Stoke-on-Trent. Been used as a field car, you know, smashed around a field with a load of other cars, so the bodywork was completely shot. It was, you know, smashed up, basically been bang erased. But they had been careful mechanically with it, so, you know, the engine was spot on. The rad hadn't popped, so it hadn't overheated. Mechanically, yeah, it was fine. 4-wheel steer still worked and everything. So that got stripped and scrapped. Over the winter, I took all the pillar trims and headliner out the Prelude, out the 4th gen, and retrimmed them in this Galaxy fabric. Dead cool looking. I think I was under a bit of a fantasy that it was like a spaceship because it had the dead cool digital dash, and I don't know, I thought it was cool anyway. That turned out really well, actually. I was quite happy with that. Obviously, I had the 5th gen, and being a VTI, that had the 5-stud hubs, which do bolt on-ish to a 4th gen. So obviously I had the idea of 5-stud swapping it, and I wanted some R32 GTR wheels because I've seen them on other Hondas and they look awesome. And I did want an R32 at the time, back when they were cheap, but I couldn't afford one. Annoyingly, if they were still 2015 money now, I could just go out and get one because they were ridiculously cheap. But whatever, that ship sailed. So I bought a set of R32 GTR wheels. I'm not sure if they're made by Enki or Volk. I've got a feeling they're Volk. So if anyone knows, stick it in the comments, because I still don't know. They were 300 quid. Placed them up against the car. Obviously, they looked awesome, because they just do. And then an Accord Type R came up for sale, local, and 500 quid. And rotten. Obviously, I bought that. I was going to put it on the road, but it was a little bit too rusty. So I thought, well, it's obviously perfect opportunity. Accord Type R engine, LSD gearbox, 300mm front brakes. That'd go straight in my Prelude-ish, and I'd have a bloody quick Prelude for hardly any money. So once I broke that, I made my 500 quid back, obviously, but I actually still had the engine, gearbox and brakes, so they were cheaper than free, to be honest. I still had most of the panels left. I mean, I think I got nearly 200 quid for the seats, so I made my money back dead quick. Bought a nice little pile of parts, Fidanza 3.6 kilo flywheel, OEM Honda clutch, all the fluids to go with it, thermal intake gasket, braided line for the fuel supply because the fuel rail on the Accord engine's different, and a few other little miscellaneous bits like that. Got a bit of help off my mate Twiggy and Jacob. You can see Jacob in this photo now. They gave me a hand doing the cam belt, the clutch, stuff like that. Just a few little maintenance jobs to try and prolong its life. When all of a sudden I was browsing eBay, don't we all? I spotted a really nice clean 4th gen in a teal colour, which I always sort of wished mine was that colour. Now that I've started to become attached to it, you know, I wish I'd been more careful and searched for one that had the right spec. So it's similar to Tahitian green, which is on the EGs and EKs, but I've never managed to get my hands on one. I've always loved it, but never managed to get my hands on that colour, even today. So it looked too clean to modify, to be honest, but it had a running issue where it was running on 3 cylinders and the seller had tried all the obvious things, so it seemed like a bit more of a terminal issue with the engine. This meant that it was probably going to get broken and scrapped by whoever bought it, because at this point it was pretty worthless. That made me feel a bit better about buying it to do a swap on. So that week I was on nights, but then I had 2 weeks off work as summer shut down, so it was the perfect opportunity to get the Prelude finished. The auction for the teal one ended a few minutes into my last night shift that week, So I warned my colleagues that I wasn't really going to be doing much for the first few minutes, and I watched the auction like a hawk, stuck a cheeky 750 quid on it, but I ended up winning it for 470 quid, so I was over the moon with that. That night shift dragged a bit because I was going to go and get it the next day. A few sort of frantic messages to my mate Tom, and he was also on nights, and we arranged that he'd drive up from his work in Plymouth the minute he finished. I'd go home 6 AM as soon as my night shift finished, get a few hours of kip, and then we'd set off in the afternoon for Norwich, and I live near Manchester, so that's a right track. So Tom rocked up in his S2000 that he had at the time. As you can see, it was a pretty damn cool thing. So we had a nice little drive down. It was going dark as we got there. These photos were actually on the seller's driveway when we turned up. Initially it was a bit sort of like, what's going on? Because it looked sort of very teal and blue in the photos on eBay, but it was like dark green in this light. That's just a characteristic of malachite blue-green pearl, to give it its proper name. Yeah, it's a stunning colour in the sun. So I paid the seller. He was a little bit gutted because he'd paid £2.5 for it not long before, but then it had dropped a valve, as it turned out. And I'd actually seen the advert and wished that I could get it, but I didn't want to spend that on a car to rip apart. It just didn't really make sense to rip the engine out because it was perfectly working, fully original car, so I left it, to be honest. Yeah, I just didn't want to ruin it. Now it was broken, might as well tear it apart and buy it and tear it apart. Set off back home. It was cutting out at lights. It was a bit of a pig to drive, to be honest, but once it was up to speed, stuck it on cruise control, 80 mile an hour, and you wouldn't know there was an issue. It was perfect. Really nice, quiet, smooth to drive. Very little wind noise, tyre noise, no interior rattles. It was just a really genuine, straight, nice car. Somehow took ages and ages to get back. The sun was coming up as we got back. Plenty of coffee stops, but yeah, we turned up and the sun was coming up on the Saturday morning, I think it was. Drove it around for a little bit that week just to get some nice photos of it while it was still totally original. It did have an exhaust on it, that was a bit crap. Apart from that, it was totally bone stock original. So I started taking the panels off to avoid damaging them. It was a bit of a moment of truth taking the side skirts off because it did have very slight bubbling on the rear arches. Not bad at all, but there was something there. So it was a bit of a, you know, but yeah, we got the skirts off to reveal absolutely perfect sills. You know, they were still shiny, they were spot on. Pulled the engine out, started cleaning up the engine bay with a bit of degreaser, and you can see in the background one of my old cars, which was a Jap import Toyota AE 111 Levin. That was a cool car. I might do a video on that at some point. Once the engine bay was dry, I painted some of the lower areas where Honda don't bother painting, it's just primer, just to tidy it up a bit. I wish I'd done a bit more of the bay, to be honest, because you can't see any of the stuff that I've done. I actually did quite a nice job of it, as you can see from these photos that are up now. I got the engine loom and the vehicle speed sensor modified by VTEC Direct. The Prelude VSS has these two lines coming off it that feed the four-wheel steer ECU. They tell it how fast the car's going and tell it what to do. So you can't just use the Accord VSS, but the cog, the drive cog on the bottom of the Prelude and Accord VSSs are different. So you have to get the cog off the Accord VSS and put it onto the Prelude VSS. So I got VTEC Direct to do that, and they modified the loom a bit. Finally starting to make use of the 5th gen VTI parts car that I scrapped the year before. I swapped the sunroof because the 5th gen one uses a glass panel like that, which I much prefer. I don't like metal sunroofs. What's the point in even having it if it doesn't let any light in? It needs a little bit of modification, but it's pretty straightforward. I mean, I did it, so it can't be that hard. My granddad approved of it. One of his neighbours used to have a red 3rd gen at the end of his road, and he used to say how much he liked it when I was a kid. Got the engine in with help from a few of my mates. You might see the odd cider can here and there. As soon as I was off work, I didn't need to go anywhere the next day for the whole 2 weeks. Most of the build I was half pissed, or fully pissed. Literally a few minutes after the engine was bolted in and sat on the mounts, the red arrows flew over, which has got to be one of the coolest things that's ever happened during like a car build. It was, you know, it was a right good little moment. So once it was actually in, I was kind of on my own then because my mates had to go to work, stuff like that. So I had to get it running on my own. But luckily the loom was modified, I had the fuel line, VSS modified, I'd done all that. So it was just a case of hooking everything back up. And the first start was at like 1:30 AM on a Sunday morning, I think. I could see the neighbours were still up, so I just sent it. Right, there it goes. open downpipe, so it was loud, but you know, I was a bit excited and a little bit pissed. It didn't run that well because it still needed a couple of wires extending, which we were going to do when it was in the car, so we knew how long they'd need to be, so they weren't too long or too short. Just for the idle control valve and a few other bits, and it was on the standard ECU as well, so it wasn't getting the right fuel and stuff like that. Took it down the road to see if it'd actually move, and then when it did, stuck the panels back on, and pre-facelift headlights from my old one, which was actually a facelift, but it had pre-face headlights. Took the Skunk 2 exhaust and the AEM V2 intake off the old one, stuck them on. Took the car to rev limit tuning with a socketed P28 ECU for Jay to map. He basically just stuck a base map on it and then just tuned it a bit, just a quick half-an-hour job just to get it running safe. To be fair, it made 213 brake, which is pretty decent considering, you know, it's been thrown together. The engine was old, out of a high mileage car and whatnot. A couple of months later, I've been driving the car around for a bit at this point, so I was happy that it worked and it was all pretty sound, but I wanted to make it look good. So this was the time to go and get the 5th gen hubs from the yard, unbolt them from the subframe that they've been sat on in the rain for best part of a year. Also set a lowering springs off the old one that was also up in the yard. As far as I remember, this was pretty straightforward. The front knuckle I pretty much just bolted on as it was, put new ball joints in it. I think VTEC Direct pressed them in for me. I think the drive shafts just go straight in using the 4th gen shafts. Can't remember which calipers I used at this point. It must have been the 4th gen. I don't remember bleeding the brakes, so I must have left the 4th gen calipers on and bolted them to the 5th gen hubs. The rear required some sort of creative use of washers to get it all to turn freely and get the ABS sensors out of the way and stuff like that. And the hub nut on the back couldn't go on all the way. There was like one thread left. People told me it'd be fine, but I was a little bit about it. It has been fine. So got it finished the next day. I was meant to be going to RAF Cosford for an event on. There was an ex-SR71 Blackbird pilot doing a bit of a presentation. So I would have loved to have gone to that, but I didn't get it finished in time, so I had to miss out. But oh well, it was ready for JAE, which was the next day, and I got it all back together, cleaned. I think I road tested it, but only around town, you know, I hadn't really done any proper miles in it with the hub swap done. So it was all a little bit up in the air as to whether I'd get there. As you can see, it looked ace at this point. I left the centre caps off because I know I'd been assured that the hub nuts would be fine, but I was just a little bit iffy about them. So I wanted to check them with a breaker bar a couple of times along the journey. Had a really bad brake judder because I just used the standard 5th gen discs that were on it that had been sat in the yard for all that time, so they were all rusty. But by the time I got to JAE, they were all right, to be honest. The vibrations are pretty much gone. JAE that year was at Newark, which is right next to a really good little air museum. So my mate Andy put his best begging voice on and we were allowed in to photograph our cars under the Vulcan, which was amazing. Hopefully I can start bringing a bit more Cold War jet sort of content to the channel when the world sort of starts to open up again. So the car, at this point that you see it in these photos, with the Accord Type R engine, box, LSD, 5th gen hubs, all that stuff, R32 wheels, I reckon it owed me about £1,000, maybe less. I mean, the car was 470 quid. The donor car, the Accord, was 500 quid, but I made a profit on that. So the engine, box and brakes were, well, cheaper than free. 450 quid, give or take, in parts, if I remember correctly. You know, the cam belt, flywheel, clutch, all that stuff. R32 wheels for 300 quid. I'm counting the hub swap as free because I already had the 5th gen as a parts car from when the cam belt went on the other one. So the hubs were just a bonus, really. Can't remember where the tyres came from, but they won't have been much. They were part Wartons, I know that much. So it was standing me at 1,220 quid from my quick workings out here, and that's without the profit from the Accord. So if you take the Accord into account, it's got to be under £1,000. And for less than £1,000, can you argue with that? I think it's awesome. I think it's a really good little car for no money at all, really. So I put the car away for winter soon after JAE, and when I got it back out, the cog that was on the VSS fell off. So I took the VSS off to investigate and try and fish the cog out, at which point the cog just fell straight into the bottom of the diff or the gearbox or whatever. Now, I'd been told that I could probably drive it a short distance as long as I was careful, and that wasn't true. So I tried stupidly driving it to VTEC Direct to get them to fish it out and repair it, and it just made some horrible noises. The cog had just got chewed up in the diff and there was bits of metal everywhere. The gearbox didn't, it didn't breach the casing, but once the gearbox was opened, yeah, it was a right mess. So I started stripping another Accord that I bought off my mate. Sorry, Chaz, but it was pretty rotten, to be fair. I don't like breaking cars, but when they are that rotten, it's, what can you do? Keeps other cars on the road. So that was another 500 quid Accord Type R. I don't think I'll get one for that money these days because the cats are worth more than that, unfortunately. My mate was looking for a daily, Ant, so I managed to convince him that what he needed was a Prelude, and he found one. Nice JDM SI in black, SI VTEC, sorry. Supposedly a lightweight model with no four-wheel steer or anything like that. I think it had a solid roof, no sunroof. It was a nice thing, to be honest. It had a few bodges and bits of dodgy wiring, but yeah, it was pretty nice. So then I took it back to VTEC Direct to fit my Accord front brakes, groove discs, and get the gearbox swap, and just a few other little bits, a few little loose ends to tie up, get the ABS working. I think the four-wheel steer was playing up a bit as well, so they sorted that out. All this was because I booked a track day. At this point, I should point out that I'm well into my British Cold War aircraft, and I think the Victor is probably the king of them for me. But it's such a cool looking thing, it still looks futuristic today, despite the fact that it was developed and built in like the early 50s. Now, I knew that RAF Marham, which is where a lot of the Victor squadrons were based for years and years, decades even, they used to host track days. So I thought I'd have a quick Google to see if they were still doing them. And as luck would have it, there was one coming up, like probably a couple of months later. So I asked a few of my mates if they fancied it, and they said yeah, including Ant with the SI VTEC that I just mentioned. The main reason that I booked it, to be honest, was because I couldn't think of anything cooler than hooning around such a special place with the Victor connection in a in a cool car and having a right laugh. Honestly, this weekend was one of the best weekends of my life. It was brilliant. So thanks Ant, Kieran, Jacob and Twiggy. It was one hell of a weekend. Prelude was ace. I was worried because obviously I'd thrown it together myself. A bit of help from some of my mates. Yeah, I was pretty worried, with it being so far away as well. It was like 4 hours away. So if anything did go wrong, I was a bit knackered. Especially with what I was going to be putting it through. There's some serious straights there, so the engine was going to be wide open throttle for most of the lap. mentioned it actually, but the Accord that I got the engine out of had done 175,000 miles. It was a bit smoky, used a bit of oil, and it had some pretty bad piston slaps, especially when it was cold. While it was fast, it was, you know, not a mint engine. It spent the whole weekend hitting 150 mile an hour, lap after lap after lap. Two minor issues. The first was the rusty power steering cooler. That started leaking, and we were under strict instructions from the RAF not to spill fluids, so that was a bit of a worry. I thought that was going to end my weekend. In the end, I wrapped it dead tightly with electrical tape, and then wrapped a microfiber cleaning cloth around it and cable tied that dead tight, so it was still leaking, but it wasn't dripping because the cloth was absorbing it. Kept topping it up, and it was sound. You can probably see that actually in the bumper grill in some of the photos, the little yellow cloth in the middle. And then the other issue, the exhaust snapped, so it suddenly got really, really loud. And after that, it'd only do 140, so it was losing a bit of power, and it wouldn't idle very well. It just kept revving itself right up to 4,000 and back down, just constantly. So it was a bit hard to drive at low speed, but it was fine when you was flat out. That was because the lambda sensor couldn't get a decent reading. Happily, however, it's an RAF base, an active RAF base at that, so a Honda Prelude with an open downpipe does not compare to an RAF Tornado on a full afterburner takeoff. Consider black flagging me. I was just allowed to crack on, which I don't think that happened anywhere else in the country, to be honest. Doing 150 mile an hour between rows and rows of tornado hangers is still to this day one of the coolest things I've ever been able to do. Car was an absolute dream apart from them two little issues. They were really minor, to be honest. And the handling, it was that stable, it was almost a little bit boring. I ended up being proper stupid, throwing it into big sweeping bends at over 100 mile an hour, braking, and it just wouldn't do anything. It was just that stable. Impressive, to be honest. I think the four-wheel steer helps with that, and obviously quite a long wheelbase, and good tyres as well. There was one moment that was a little bit dodgy, so I'm doing probably 140 plus, getting on for 150. A Jag XKR comes flying past, so he must be doing 160 plus, and then RAF Ford Fiesta decides to cross the track, and it's not very far away. You can just see it in this video, just trundling away to the left. Doing this track day meant that I also got to see Victor XH673, which was the last remaining Victor owned by the RAF. Now there was 5 left in total in the world, but this was the only one that you can't just go and see anytime, because the rest of them are in museums, so you can just go anytime. But this being on an RAF base, this was the only opportunity you'd get to see it, this kind of thing. Sadly, it's now been scrapped due to corrosion, or depending on how cynical you are, it could be politics. But I'm glad that I did actually get to see it. We couldn't get out the cars and have a walk around it and see it up close, but you know, just driving past, you know, I could tick it off the list sort of thing. After that, I spent 2017 just enjoying it, to be honest. I put 7,000 miles on it in total. Drove it all over the place, drove it to work, drove it up to the Lake District. Me and Chloe went on our first date in it to Pizza Hut in Crewe. I know how to treat a woman. And then around this time, I saw a post on Facebook asking for modified Japanese cars to help with a TV shoot. Didn't know what it was for, but I thought, yeah, I'm well up for this. Turned up, and it was for Car SOS, and I think it ended up being on the Impreza episode. So if you want to see it, have a watch of that. I ended up doing a fat burnout, and my side marker light fell out, and I ran it over. But it was all worth it because it did actually make the cut and was shown on TV. So that's immortalised forever. Although you can't see the marker light falling out. Might be a good thing. Did a track session at Tuna Fest at Alton Park. Scared the crap out of Chloe. My car got vandalised by my mates just as I was pulling out onto the track, and I couldn't do anything about it. I think that was Max, and I did get him back, sticking some Renault Sport stickers on his Renault engined Nissan. Then I bought a JDM SI for a few £100 that had the one-piece headlights, which looked a lot cleaner, a lot nicer. The black housings as well. That had a graphic equaliser in the dash. Bronze windows, which I was going to put in mine, but I ended up not doing because various reasons. So you might be wondering where it is now. Well, typical H22 gremlins kicked in, and the crank pulley started wobbling, which is quite a common thing. Well, it'd been wobbling for a while, but it got really bad, fell off and stranded us in a car park on a Welsh mountain till about 2 a.m, till recovery arrived. So that was great. And this was still when me and Chloe first started going out, so I don't think it was the best impression, but we're still together now. Can't have been too bad. After that, I tried a few crank pulleys, but they all wobbled. So that suggests the bottom end's on its way out, you know, the thrust washers or the crank bearings or even the end of the crank. Something's knackered. So I was driving it occasionally, but you know, I knew its days were numbered. The wobble got that bad that it eventually snapped the alternator belt, and I was driving it in the dark. Luckily, I'd fitted some LED headlight bulbs, so the current draw was pretty low. So I managed to get home, and then it just got parked up, to be honest, because I had other cars. At that point, life sort of got in the way a bit. Bought a house. Every spare penny that we had went into renovating the house. So the Prelude sat in the garden with weeds growing around it for probably over a year, to be honest. Last year, during lockdown, got it fired up. You know, I threw a charged battery onto it, started it up, and it ran. Drove it out, gave it a good wash, and it's now on the driveway, and that's where it sits now. At least it's not in the weeds with, you know, all the wet grass and all that crap rotting it away. But yeah, that is where it sits now. That brings us up to 2021. What happened to the blue one? Well, it sat in the yard until early this year. I decided it was too far gone, so I had to scrap it, to be honest. I absolutely hate scrapping cars, especially with some of the memories that I had with it. You know, it did mean quite a bit to me, that car, but it was in a really bad way, and I was losing the storage. And with all the other cars that I have, it was just another headache that I didn't need. And it was really rotten. It would have needed loads of work to get it back on the road. I had to just scrap it. I took everything off it, especially that dash, because that's the coolest thing ever. I'm still a bit sad about it, but in a way relieved, because it's one less headache. I think that rounds off this story so far. Hopefully I'm sort of back on my feet now after the house renovation, so I can start cracking on with my cars. Get them on the road, make them nice again. We're hoping to have a garage built this year, and that'll really sort of change everything. At the minute, I'm doing everything on my parents' drive, so that's big jobs are sort of out the window. The only car I've actually really got on the road is my Borer, and I'm getting a little bit bored of driving that now. But yeah, the bigger jobs are just out of the question because I just haven't got anywhere to do them. If you made it this far, I think congratulations are in order, because I have waffled on a bit. Apologies for that, but I did want to get the story across and make the point that, you know, you can have a car that's not, you know, one of these JDM hero cars, and you can still absolutely love it and just have a brilliant time, make some good memories, and just enjoy yourself for not much money. Get out there and buy some. Another car that this sort of applies to is stuff like FTOs. You know, they're a 200 brake car. They're not slow. They're not the FT slow, I don't think, that people call them. They're really pretty. I have got one lined up actually to do a review on next week, so I'm really looking forward to that. So stick around if you're interested in that. That's another undervalued, underappreciated car that I think is really cool. I do really appreciate people giving me time out of the day to watch these, so I do try and make them as entertaining as I can, but that does mean obviously it takes a lot of editing time. I wanted to try something new, so I've put quite a bit of time into scripting it. Hopefully it's worked out. And please comment below any feedback, anything that I can do differently. What do you think of the Prelude? Anything that you want to see on the channel really. See you next time.